A woman I didn't know sent me a friend request. We became close over 6 weeks. Then she asked me to stand beside her at her wedding and sent me the invitation. The groom's name was my husband. I've been trying to write this post for 3 weeks. I've started it 11 times. Each version begins differently, some angry, some clinical, one that opened with a joke because sometimes when the thing you're processing is so structurally absurd that even your therapist paused and said, "I'm sorry, say that again," the only available response is to find the dark comedy in it and hold on to it like a rope. The version you're reading is the one where I've accepted that there is no perfect way to tell this story, that whatever I write is going to sound like something I made up, and that the only thing I can do about that is tell it as plainly and completely as possible and let you decide. Everything I'm about to tell you is true. I know how it sounds. It sounds like a screenplay that got rejected for being too contrived. It sounds like the kind of thing people write when they want internet sympathy and have decided that the more elaborate the story, the more compelling the sympathy. I understand why you might think that. I would probably think that too, reading it cold. All I can tell you is that I lived it, and that living it felt nothing like a screenplay. It felt like standing in a room where the walls were moving, where the floor you'd believed was solid was revealing itself to have been, for quite some time, made of something else entirely. My name is Priya. I'm 32 years old. I've been married to a man I'll call Seth for 4 years, together for 7. I work in UX design for a mid-sized tech company, which means I spend a lot of time thinking about how people interact with information and what makes an experience intuitive versus confusing, which I mention not because it's relevant to the story in any direct way, but because it has become, in the months since, a source of private dark irony, that I am professionally attuned to the gaps between what an interface presents and what's actually happening underneath it, and I miss the gap in my own marriage for what I now believe was approximately 2 years. Seth was a project manager at a construction development firm. Tall, organized, funny in the dry way that requires timing, the kind of person who remembers the names of waitstaff and tips well and holds doors without making a performance of it. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party when I was 25, and we fit together in the easy, uncomplicated way that I've come to understand is either the luckiest thing that can happen to you or the most dangerous, because ease makes you stop looking closely. When nothing requires effort, you stop checking whether it's real. He was a good husband. I want to say that with the precision the words deserve, not as revisionism, not as sentimentality, but as an accurate description of what I observed across 7 years of a shared life. He was attentive and kind and present in the daily, unglamorous sense. He did the dishes without being asked. He remembered the anniversary of my mother's death every year without needing a reminder. He was the person who drove 4 hours when my college friend had a crisis, not because he particularly liked her, but because I needed to be there and he needed to be where I was. These things were real. I've spent a significant amount of time in the months since sitting with the fact that 2 things can be simultaneously true: that he was a genuinely good husband in most of the ways that day-to-day marriage requires, and that he had been running a parallel life for somewhere in the vicinity of 2 years. The social media request came on a Thursday in March. Her name was Lily Beaumont, and we had 11 mutual friends, which was enough to make the request feel like something that had arrived via a legitimate network rather than out of nowhere. I looked at her profile the way you look at the profile of someone you're about to accept, just enough to confirm that she seemed like a real person with a real life and no obvious red flags, and accepted without overthinking it. She looked like someone I might know peripherally. Her profile was warm and curated in the specific way that indicates a person who uses social media thoughtfully rather than obsessively, not hundreds of posts, just a clear life, clearly lived. She worked in event planning. Her bio said she was based in a city about 90 minutes from mine, which I noted as slightly unusual for someone with 11 mutual friends, but not unusual enough to be interesting. She was attractive in a way I registered neutrally, the way you register the attractiveness of a stranger. She messaged me 3 days after I accepted. Just something light. She'd seen a post I'd made about a hiking trail I'd done the previous weekend, said she'd been wanting to do that same trail, asked if I had any tips. It was the exact correct calibration of an opening message from someone you don't know well, specific enough to be genuine, low stakes enough to require nothing significant in return. I wrote back. She wrote back. It was the beginning of what, over the following 6 weeks, became a genuine online friendship of the kind that develops when two people who share sensibilities find each other via the semi-random machinery of social media and discover they're unexpectedly compatible. I liked Lily. I want to be unambiguous about this because it matters. I genuinely liked her. She was funny, the specific self-aware kind of funny that doesn't require an audience, that is there in the texture of how she described things rather than in performed punchlines. She was interested in things in the way that makes conversation feel like an exchange rather than a performance. She asked follow-up questions. She told stories that were self-deprecating without being self-flagellating. Over 6 weeks of messages and comments and eventually 2 phone calls that ran longer than either of us planned, I developed the kind of low-key affection for her that I associate with people I want to actually know. I did not tell Seth about her, particularly. I mentioned in passing that I'd been talking to someone I'd connected with online, the way you mentioned peripheral social developments to espouse, present but not featured. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't think anything of that. The phone calls had been her initiative, which I note not because it was suspicious at the time, but because it became relevant later. She'd said she preferred talking to texting for longer conversations, which was a preference I shared, and we'd had 2 calls that were easy and wide-ranging and which covered, across their combined 3 hours or so, most of the standard getting-to-know-someone territory, work, family, the city she lived in, the city I lived in, relationships, the peculiar specific experience of being a woman in your early 30s, navigating the parts of life that require navigation. She told me about her fiancé on the first call. Not extensively, just enough to establish that he existed, that she was engaged, that the wedding was being planned for the following October. She described him briefly in the way you describe a partner to someone you're just getting to know, a few characteristic details, an affectionate adjective or 2, a short anecdote that illustrated something she found endearing about him. His name in those early mentions came up as a nickname. The kind of nickname that is so specific to a relationship's private vocabulary that it doesn't map onto a person's actual name without context. I didn't ask his name. This was not suspicious. You don't always ask. The maid of honor conversation happened on the second phone call, which was on a Tuesday evening in late April. We'd been talking for a while, moving through various topics, and at some point she circled to the wedding planning, which had been consuming a significant portion of her energy. She said she was struggling with the maid of honor situation, that her closest friend, who had been the obvious choice, had recently moved abroad, and the logistical reality of having someone in that role from another time zone was proving complicated. She'd been thinking about it a lot. She said, and I want to give you the exact quality of this moment because I've replayed it more times than I can count. I know this is going to sound crazy because we've only known each other for 6 weeks, but I've been thinking about you for this. I laughed. The honest, slightly startled laugh of someone receiving an unexpected thing. I said something like, "That's wild. We've never even met in person." She said she knew, and that she understood if it was too much, but that she'd felt more genuinely compatible with me in 6 weeks than she felt with people she'd known for years, which was a thing she'd been turning over and couldn't stop turning over. She said the role didn't have to be elaborate. She wasn't asking for a traditional maid of honor experience. She was just asking whether I might want to be her person for it, the friend standing next to her. She said she would completely understand if I said no. I didn't say no immediately. I said I needed to think about it, which was true. Standing in someone's wedding when you hadn't met them in person was a genuine, reasonable thing to think about. But I was moved by the ask in the way I'd been moved throughout our growing friendship, with a particular warmth of recognizing someone who matches you in ways that are hard to manufacture. I told her I'd let her know by the weekend. She sent me the invitation that night. She said she wanted me to have the formal details, that it would help me picture it, and that there was no pressure, that the invitation was just information. I opened the invitation PDF the next morning. I need to tell you about the 20 or so seconds between opening the invitation and understanding what I was looking at, because I think those seconds are the most important part of the story to describe accurately. The brain, when it encounters something impossible, does not process it cleanly. It does something more like a stutter, a repeated presentation of the information, each time with a slight adjustment of the interpretive frame, as if the information will eventually find a frame it fits into. It is not like a sudden impact. It is more like someone slowly turning up the volume on a sound that was always there until the sound becomes undeniable. The groom's name on the invitation was not the nickname she'd used on the phone calls. It was Seth's name. His full name. First, middle, last. The middle name that only people who knew him well enough to have seen official documents would know. The last name that was also my last name had been my last name for 4 years, was my last name right now this morning, reading this invitation at my kitchen table with coffee in my hand and my husband, who had left for work 45 minutes earlier, not present to see my face. I put the coffee down. This I remember clearly, setting the mug down very carefully, with the specific deliberateness of someone who is concerned about motor function in the face of information that is trying to undo their motor function. I looked at the invitation again. City. 90 minutes from mine. Venue. A hotel I did not recognize. Date. October. The groom's name. My husband's name, in full, in the elegant serif font that Lily had apparently chosen for the printed materials of the wedding she was planning to a man she had been engaged to for what, reading the small print at the bottom of the invitation, was described as a 3-year relationship. 3 years. They had been engaged, not just together, engaged for some portion of a period that overlapped entirely with our marriage. I sat at the table for a long time. The coffee went cold. Light moved through the kitchen windows the way it does in the mid-morning, shifting from the particular gold of early day to the flatter, less forgiving light of the hours that don't have anything special about them. I was aware of this light. I was aware of the refrigerator humming. I was aware of the sound of the street outside, a delivery truck at some point, a dog, the neighbor's car door. I was aware of all of it with the hyperspecific attentiveness of a person whose ordinary perceptual apparatus has been knocked slightly loose from its moorings. I did not cry. I note this because it surprised me, and because it tells me something about what was happening internally, not the hot, immediate grief of something you've just lost, but the colder, slower processing of something you're realizing was never quite what you thought. Grief was in there. It was just underneath something else. Underneath the shock, underneath the structural impossibility of the information on the screen, was a very quiet, very contained fury that I did not have vocabulary for yet, but that I could feel organizing itself with a patience that frightened me slightly. Let me tell you what I knew, sitting at that table. I knew that Seth had been with this woman for at least 2 years. I knew that she had a separate life, in a different city, where she was understood to be engaged to my husband. I knew that she did not know I existed. This was the conclusion that took the least reasoning, because nothing in 6 weeks of genuine friendship had contained the shadow of a woman who believed she was pursuing a married man's wife as a social conquest. Lily was not a villain. I understood this with a certainty that surprised me with its clarity. Whatever Lily was, whatever she had been told, whatever version of Seth's life she had been given, she had not known about me. The architecture of what Seth had built became visible in the same way that those optical illusion pictures resolve, suddenly, completely, all at once, in a way that makes the previous version of what you were seeing feel not just wrong but impossible to return to. He had 2 lives. Clean, separate, 90 minutes apart. A wife in the city. A fiancé in that one. Both of us operating inside what we believed was a complete picture, neither of us knowing there was another frame. I called my best friend Danny from the kitchen table. I said, I need to tell you something and I need you to not react yet. I need you to just listen until I'm done. She said okay in the voice she uses when she's already bracing. I told her everything: the friend request 6 weeks, the phone calls, the maid of honor ask, the invitation, the name. I told it in order, in the same flat tone I was using to talk to myself in my head, the tone that keeps the bottom from falling out if you concentrate on it hard enough. When I finished, there was a silence that had real weight, and then Danny said, very quietly, "Oh my God." "Yeah," I said. "What are you going to do?" This was the question. The one I'd been sitting with since I'd set the coffee down. Because there were things available to me in that moment that were understandable and perhaps justifiable, and that I knew, even then, I was not going to do. I was not going to call Seth at work. I was not going to text him a photo of the invitation. I was not going to do any of the explosive, immediate things that the situation had every right to demand, because I had learned enough about myself in 32 years to know that decisions made from the first wave of this kind of feeling tend to be decisions you spend a long time downstream trying to understand. But I was also not going to sit in the kitchen and plan for 11 months because I am not, constitutionally, that kind of contained. What I was going to do, I realized, was call Lily. Danny said several things about this idea, most of them sensible, few of them dissuasive, because Danny knows me well enough to know when I've already decided something and is smart enough to shift from arguing to helping. She stayed on the phone with me while I composed what I was going to say, which took longer than either of us expected because the thing I needed to say was genuinely difficult to construct. I needed to tell Lily the truth without turning the conversation into something she would defend against, which meant starting from a place of genuine care for her rather than from the place of a woman whose marriage had just been revealed as a fiction, which was where most of me was actually located. I called Lily at 11:30 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, with the warm, unguarded voice of someone who is genuinely happy to see my name on her screen.
"Priya," she said.
"I was hoping you'd call. I hope the invitation wasn't too much. I wanted you to have all the—" "Lily," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I'm telling you because I care about you, and that what I'm about to say is not something I'm saying to hurt you. I need you to hear that first." She went quiet. The specific quiet of someone whose nervous system has just registered that the call has changed. "Okay," she said.
Carefully.
"The name on the invitation?" I said. "The groom's name. The full name." A pause. "His last name?" I said. "His last name is my last name. Has been for 4 years." I let that sit for a moment. Then, "I'm his wife, Lily." The silence that followed was the longest I've experienced on a phone call. Not because she didn't respond. She did respond, eventually in the fragmented, reprocessing way of someone whose understanding of their own life is being rebuilt in real time from the ground up. But before she responded, there was a silence that I could hear her existing inside, the same silence I'd sat in at my kitchen table, and I held the phone and let her be in it because it was the most respectful thing I could do. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was lower and careful, and had underneath it a trembling quality that she was visibly, audibly, working to control. "He told me," she said slowly, "that he had been married. Briefly. Years ago. That it ended. That she left. That there was nothing." She stopped. Her breathing was audible. "He said he hadn't talked about it because it was painful and he'd moved past it." I closed my eyes. "He said her name was Priya," she said, with the specific, shattered quality of someone arriving at a recognition that reorganizes everything they thought they understood. I said, very quietly, "Yes." She made a sound that I don't want to try to describe because I don't think I can do it accurately and because it is hers. That sound, the particular undoing of a woman who has just understood what has been done to her, and it deserves more privacy than a Reddit post can give it. What I can tell you is that we talked for 2 hours. 2 hours that were unlike any 2 hours I've spent on the phone. Not a conversation exactly, more like two people walking through the same rubble from different points of entry, meeting somewhere in the middle, finding they were holding the same pieces of something that had been one structure from the outside and was, from the inside, divided. We compared what we knew. Not in the spirit of investigation. We weren't building a case. We were just filling in each other's picture, because both of us had a version of Seth that was partial, and putting them together produced something neither of us could have seen alone. The Seth Lily knew was thoughtful and emotionally available and talked about his feelings in ways she'd found unusually mature for a man, which I recognized because it was true of the Seth I knew too. The Seth Lily knew went on work trips to my city approximately once a month, which was where he said he was when he came home to me for those weekends with the easy, settled quality of a man returning to where he belonged. The Seth Lily knew had never introduced her to his family, which he'd explained with a sensitivity about his family dynamics that she'd found moving rather than suspicious. The Seth I knew had client dinners on nights that, as I was now understanding, mapped with uncomfortable precision onto evenings when he'd arrived home later than his normal schedule would have required. The Seth she was engaged to and the Seth I was married to were the same person arranged into 2 configurations, one for each city, with the seam between them maintained through a system of explanations so consistently calibrated to each woman's existing understanding of him that neither of us had ever seen the edge of the story we were living in. By the time we hung up, and the hanging up was its own thing, the strange tenderness of ending a phone call with someone who is now, in the specific and unprecedented way of this situation, the person in the world who most completely understands what you are going through, I knew a few things with a certainty that no longer required verification. Seth was not coming home to the version of himself I'd believed I'd married. Lily was not going to plan the October wedding any further. And whatever happened in the next weeks and months, the two of us were not going to be navigating it without each other. I want to tell you about the moment Seth came home. I've been thinking about how to describe it since I started writing this post, because it is simultaneously the most important moment in the story and the hardest one to convey without distorting it into something it wasn't. He came through the front door at 6:47. I know the time because I was looking at my phone when I heard the key in the lock, not doing anything with it, just holding it the way you hold something when you need to have something in your hands. I was sitting on the couch. I had been sitting on the couch since I'd finished talking to Lily, with a glass of water I'd made myself drink, and a very specific internal state that I had spent several hours arriving at, and which I would describe as clear, not calm. I want to be honest about that. Calm is not the right word, because calm implies the absence of feeling, and the feeling was very much present. But clear. I knew exactly what I knew, and I knew what I was going to do with it, and the clarity had a kind of steel in it that made calm unnecessary. Seth came in the way he always came in, dropping his bag by the door, running a hand through his hair, making the small transitional sounds of someone moving from the outside world to the inside one. He saw me on the couch and said something ordinary, asked about my day, started toward the kitchen. "Seth," I said. He stopped. Something in the way I said it, just the one word, just his name, but with the quality that names acquire when they're being used as the final thing before a different kind of talking begins, made him stop completely and turn and look at me. I picked up my phone. I turned the screen to face him. I had the wedding invitation still open on it, his name, her name, the date in October, the venue 90 minutes away in the city where he had, for years, been someone else's fiancé. I watched his face do what faces do when they have nowhere left to go. Not the careful negotiation of someone who still has options, not the rapid calculation of someone looking for an exit. Just the end of the architecture. The moment when the structure collapses not from a single blow but from the weight of its own unsustainability, all at once, quietly.
He sat down.
He did this without being asked, like a man whose legs have made the decision on behalf of the rest of him. He sat and he looked at the invitation, and he looked at me and he said nothing for a very long time.
I did not say, "How could you?"
I did not say, "How long?" I did not say any of the things that were available to me in that moment, because I had 2 hours of conversation with Lily to draw on, and I already knew most of what the questions would produce. What I said, after a silence that was long enough to make clear I was not going to fill it for him, was, "She asked me to be her maid of honor." He closed his eyes.
"She doesn't know," I said.
"She's not a part of this in the way that makes her responsible for it. I need you to understand that I know that, and that I've spoken with her, and that she is having a version of today that is not better than mine." He opened his eyes. In them was the particular expression of a man who has been confronted with the full scope of what he's done, and is in the first seconds of understanding that the scope is larger than even he had been able to keep in his head at once, because you can maintain a double life through compartmentalization, through the practiced act of not letting both frames exist simultaneously in your awareness. And the moment of exposure is also the moment you're finally forced to hold the whole thing at once. His face when he looked at me was the face of a man holding the whole thing. I told him I wanted him to leave that night. Not permanently. I wasn't making the permanent decision in that moment, because permanent decisions made in the worst hour of your life are rarely the permanent decisions you'd make in the 7th hour or the 7th week, when you can see more than just the immediate walls of the crisis. But for tonight, he needed to be somewhere else because I needed to be in this apartment without him while I began to understand what I was going to do next. He left. He took a bag and he left, and he was Throughout this, quiet in a way that contains something I've since described to my therapist as the specific quality of a person who knows that what they've done has exceeded the possibility of the kind of talking that might have gotten him out of previous versions of hard conversations, and who has the self-awareness to recognize that no words he has access to are appropriate to the size of what he's done. I called Lily again after he left. I'd said I would, and I did. She was staying with a friend. She had called her mother. She was, she said, in a state she didn't have words for. Not devastated in the way she'd expected devastation to feel, she said, but something more like disorientation, the sensation of a person who has been operating on a map that turned out to have significant portions of the territory wrong. "How are you?" she said, which was not a question I'd expected from her and which arrived with such genuine concern that it caught me off guard. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think I'm somewhere I've never been before." "Me too," she said. We talked for another hour. Longer than either of us needed to, maybe, but not longer than either of us wanted to, which is the kind of distinction that becomes important when you're two people who have been, by the actions of a third person, thrown into a connection neither of them would have chosen, and which is turning out to be the most honest relationship either of them has had in the day that has just occurred. I want to tell you about what happened in the weeks after, because the story doesn't end with the phone call or with Seth leaving the apartment, and because the weeks after are the part that surprised me most. Not the legal process, not the therapy, not the practical dismantling of a shared life, all of which are available to any marriage ending under any circumstances. What surprised me was Lily. We did not stop talking after that night. I've thought about this, about whether it was healthy or strange or something that needed to be examined in the clinical light of a therapeutic setting, and I've discussed it with my therapist, and what we've arrived at is that the friendship was real before the discovery, and real things don't stop being real because the context around them turns out to have been fraudulent. What Seth did to us was fraudulent. What Lily and I had in 6 weeks of messages and phone calls was not. Those are different things. And treating the second as contaminated by the first would have required me to throw out something genuine in order to maintain a tidy narrative about what the discovery meant, and I'm not willing to do that. She drove to my city 3 weeks after the phone call. We had never met in person. She knocked on the door, and I opened it, and we looked at each other for a moment that contained everything the preceding 3 weeks had been, and then she hugged me, and I let her, and we stood in my doorway, and she said, "This is very strange." "Extremely," I said. She came in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd read the invitation, where the coffee had gone cold, and we talked for 4 hours about everything except Seth, because we'd said what there was to say about Seth, and the 4 hours were for us. At the end of them, she said she should get back before dark, and she put on her coat, and picked up her bag, and looked at me at the door. "I need to say something," she said. "And I need to say it without either of us making it weird." I said, "Okay. You're one of the best people I've met in years," she said. "And I'm very angry that I met you this way. And I'm also glad I met you, which is a very complicated thing to be glad about, and I'm just going to let it be complicated." I told her I was glad too. I told her it was very complicated. We agreed on both. She's in my phone now as Lily, not as the acquaintance she was when I accepted the friend request, not as the woman from the story, not as anything that requires context to decode. Just Lily. We've had dinner twice since that afternoon, and we've talked on the phone more times than I've counted, and the friendship has the specific solidity of something that has been pressure-tested before it was even 2 months old and held. Seth, I'll tell you briefly because he deserves brevity. The divorce was filed in June. He has been, through the process, cooperative in the way of someone who has determined that cooperation is the only mode available to a person in his position. He has said the things people say, "I'm sorry, I don't understand why I did this, I need help, I'm getting help." I have no useful commentary on the sincerity of any of it. I receive it as information, and I move forward. What I know about myself, 7 months out from the morning I opened a wedding invitation at my kitchen table, is this. I am less interested in understanding why Seth did what he did than I am in understanding what the next version of my life is going to look like, because the next version of my life is something I have agency over, and the why of Seth is something I do not. And I've always been better at directing my attention toward the things that can change rather than the things that can't. I am also in possession of a friendship that began with a stranger sending me a request I almost didn't accept, which is probably the most genuinely unpredictable thing that has ever happened to me, and which I've decided to simply receive as the strange gift that it is rather than spending too much time on the question of whether it should have been possible. One more thing, because people in the comments are going to ask, the maid of honor role. I declined it, obviously. Though Lily, when she and I talked about it after the dust had settled somewhat, said she'd half considered asking me again for a different wedding sometime in the future, one that was not preceded by the specific chain of events that had characterized the first request. I told her that whenever she was ready, I'd consider it. You'd consider it, she said. I'd strongly consider it, I said. She laughed. It was the same laugh from the phone calls, the real one, the one that meant she'd found something genuinely funny rather than the polite version. The laugh I'd liked from the beginning before I knew what I was walking into. I'd liked it before. I like it now. The liking didn't need the story to make it real. The story just made it undeniable. Whatever else September did to me, and it did quite a lot, it gave me that. I'm choosing to count it. Update. Posted 5 months later. The divorce finalized last month. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in my lawyer's office, with the particular weather of a November day that seems designed to be neither one thing nor another, and I sat in the parking lot afterward for about 10 minutes before I drove home, not in distress, but in the way you sit after something that has been in process for a long time finally becomes a fact. I texted Lily, "It's done." She responded in 30 seconds with a string of things that managed to be simultaneously supportive and funny, which is the particular skill I value most in people, and which she has in abundance. We went to dinner that weekend. We went to a place neither of us had been, in a neighborhood neither of us had particular feelings about, and we had the kind of dinner where you order something you wouldn't normally order, and the conversation covers more ground than you expected, and you look up and realize it's been 3 hours and neither of you noticed. She's doing well. She's in therapy, which she started in October, and she talks about it the way people talk about something that is hard and also working. She went on one date 2 months ago, which she described to me in detail with the specific self-aware comedy of someone who is not ready but is trying to remember what ready felt like. I listened and said things that I hope were useful and did not give the advice I wasn't asked for, which is an improvement on my earlier self. I haven't been on any dates. I'm not ready, and I'm comfortable not being ready, which is itself a version of ready that I've decided to accept. The coffee machine Seth and I bought together is still in the kitchen. I've been meaning to replace it, and I keep not replacing it. Not because I'm attached to it, I don't think I am, but because the kitchen functions and the coffee is fine, and replacing things for symbolic reasons has never been my operating mode. I'll replace it when I have a reason to want a different coffee machine. My therapist said something last month that I've been thinking about since. We were talking about the past year, the full arc of it from the friend request in March to where we were sitting in November, and she said, "What do you think this year was about if you had to give it a shape?" I thought about it for a while. About the friend request and the 6 weeks and the invitation and the kitchen table and Lily's voice on the phone and Seth at the door and everything that came after. About the friendship that shouldn't have been possible and turned out to be the most durable thing to come out of the whole mess. I think, I said slowly, it was about what turns out to be real when everything fake falls away. She nodded. And what did you find? I thought about Lily. About Danny, who stayed on the phone through the worst morning and sent food to my apartment for 2 weeks without being asked. About my sister who flew in without being invited and stayed for 4 days and didn't require me to be okay before I was. About the people who showed up in the specific ways that people show up when your life falls apart, quietly and practically, and without requiring anything back. More than I expected, I said. I found more than I expected, which is, in the end, the only thing you can say about a year that gave you things you didn't ask for in the wreckage of things you thought you had. More than I expected. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.